afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. The University of Vermont has just completed its 4th Food Systems Summit. The summit is an annual event that attracts scholars, practitioners, and food system leaders for dialogue and discussion on the most pressing issues facing food systems around the world. One of the summit's keynote speakers is our guest this afternoon. She's here to share her research and her insights as a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Claire Kremen. Professor Kremen co-directs the Center for Diversified Farming Systems and the Berkeley Food Institute at the University of California. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.
Let's start talking about the Berkeley Food Institute. What is it and what does it do?
Well, the Berkeley Food Institute is really a hub at the University of California, Berkeley, connecting a number of different schools there, the School of Public Policy, the School of Public Health, the College of Natural Resources, the School of Law, and the School of Journalism. And why we have this connector function is because often food system issues, they're very complex, they're very pressing and important, and they really need people from lots of different disciplines to work together. But often what happens is people kind of get siloed in one place and they don't talk to one another. Mm-hmm. And so the whole idea behind the Berkeley Food Institute, which just started a couple of years ago, was to try to provide this kind of connector function and bring different kinds of professors and practitioners together to really talk across these issues. And in many ways, I think the Berkeley Food Institute is quite a lot like what's happening at University of Vermont here with the with the Food Systems Initiative that's here.
And so what is your research and your area of focus?
Well, my personal research, I've been working on pollinators for many years now, and pollinators in agricultural areas. Pollinators are really important in terms of producing food for us. About 30% of the food that we eat is due to the fact that we have pollinators. It requires pollinators, and pollinators are actually a lot more important than that 30% because so many of the really important elements in our diet, the fruits and vegetables, are pollinator dependent. And so for our micronutrient supply, for our vitamins, we really need those pollinators.
Now, by pollinators, you mean strictly bees?
Well, I don't mean strictly bees, but for crops, bees are the most important. Mm-hmm. But there are, of course, other creatures that pollinate, many other creatures that pollinate, flies, butterflies, beetles, birds, all kinds of things also pollinate out in the natural world. But in general, for crops, bees are the most important.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the difference between wild pollinators and domestic honeybees?
Well, with our wild pollinators, and let's talk maybe about wild bees because we are talking about crop pollination, mm-hmm. There are thousands of species around the world. 20,000 bee species is our estimate. And here in the United States, 4,000 bee species. So there are a lot of different pollinators out there besides the honeybee.
And so, for years, I think honeybees kind of flew under the radar, if you will, because they were just so effective in doing their jobs. But lately there have been some issues with some, like the colony collapse disorder affecting domestic honeybees. Does that bother wild bees as well? And what's being done to sort of help that issue?
Well, yeah, colony collapse disorder is a really serious problem with the honeybees. It isn't affecting wild pollinators, our native pollinators, because most of our native pollinators are actually solitary species. They don't form colonies, and mm-hmm. so there's no colony to collapse. But we still don't understand colony collapse disorder in honeybees. The thing that we do understand, though, is that it's got multiple causes. It's not a single cause, and it's probably due to pesticides interacting with various diseases, and also with the lack of floral resources, the lack of basically food mm-hmm. for the bees. And so some of the things that are influencing our honeybees are surely influencing our native bees as well, because they're also affected by pesticides. They're also affected by changes in habitat that are leading to the loss of floral resources. So even though native pollinators aren't suffering from colony collapse disorder, they're still suffering from some of the same threats and impacts.
And so if we're talking about domestic honeybees working with crops, what would be the problem with wild honeybees, and how could you tell if we're not seeing them in colonies how well they're doing?
First I want to say we're not talking about wild honeybees, but wild native bees, which are different species. Again, they're not social. So just to make that distinction really clear. So our wild native pollinators are actually very important in crop pollination as well, and we're really only appreciating that now through research that is being done by my lab in California and by a number of labs across the country, including Taylor Ricketts right here at University of Vermont. So we, collectively with all of this research that we've done in the United States and around the world, we're finding that these native pollinators are actually as important, if maybe not more important, than the honeybees in providing these pollination services. But what happens often in these really large farms, if they're very large and very kind of clean farming farms, that it's not a great place for our native pollinators, that they don't persist well there because there really isn't the sequence of floral resources around that provides what native pollinators need. And so our farming system, in a way, is not promoting our wild pollinators, even though it could really be benefiting from them.
Can you give me some examples of that? I mean, what is a clean farm, and what do wild pollinators depend on as far as different plants?
Well, a clean farm would be, for example, fence row to fence row planting. So, getting rid of all the weeds, for example, not having any other kind of vegetation around. The opposite would be what I would call a diversified farm. And a diversified farm would have maybe smaller farm fields, more different types of crop plantings that flower at different times. It would have hedgerows of maybe native vegetation or just non-crop vegetation planted around the farm edges, and that really provides a lot of habitat for the pollinators, as well as it can be aesthetically pleasing. It can provide a windbreak. It can provide habitat for other kinds of beneficial insects, like those that control crop pests. And there can be other things that farmers can do. If they're growing an orchard, they could have cover crop underneath that they let bloom, like clover, for example. Really, really great for pollinators because they love those kinds of blossoms. But basically what pollinators need are two main things. They need a sequence of floral resources. That means something blooming throughout their flight season. Now here in Vermont, that flight season would be pretty short, probably, at least compared to California. It'd be, from your quick spring that happens here through to through the summer. In California, our flight season is practically the whole year long, and so we need to have something blooming practically the entire year. And then the other thing that they really need are nesting sites, and our wild bees have many different styles of nesting. Some of them nest in the ground. They need some undisturbed ground for that. Some of them nest in pre-existing holes in trees that are made maybe by beetles boring or other things. And so, having some trees around, having some undisturbed ground is important for the nesting part of what they do.
And so you've done this research and you found all these things out. Now you need to sort of translate that into action.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the neat things about pollinators and the research we've done on pollinators is that a lot of the things that we need to do for pollinators help with a lot of other aspects of farming. And I mentioned the other beneficial insects already. If we want to kind of get away from intensive use of pesticides, which is great for people's health as well as for bees' health, then we really need to have natural enemies of crop pests. And that means other insects, it means birds. So we need to encourage those kinds of animals in our landscapes. And fortunately, a lot of what we can do for pollinators really helps those kinds of natural enemies as well. And so it kind of goes together because that's really the third leg. In addition to the floral resources and the nesting habitat, we need to reduce our use of pesticides in order to promote bees. So we need to have an alternative, and that alternative really are the natural enemies.
And so is that an easy sell, though, for farmers who are kind of used to doing things the same way? And, if you're a farmer, time is money, everything is money. And so to kind of switch around what you're doing, someone has to kind of take the lead on that and do it.
That's right. Yeah, no, I don't want to minimize how difficult it is. It isn't an easy sell because I think one of the biggest concerns is, if I do this, will I be successful?
Right.
So there's the fear that, you're risking something by not using those pesticides. And so it's more of it's a longer process. I think we need to really support our farmers out there with a lot of information. We need to do more research on what are really effective ways of controlling pests without the use of pesticides. And we need to provide that support through extension services. And this is something that has, in many ways around the country, there's been less and less of this kind of work rather than more and more.
Right.
And a lot more of the extension, sort of extension in quotes, is being provided more by the companies that sell the inputs. And a lot of the companies that sell the inputs are selling pesticides. So there's a conflict of interest right there.
Right. And so you're based in California. Tell us a little bit about how the drought's affecting farmers and food production in the West.
Well, one of the things that's happening is that farmers are sinking in deeper and deeper wells to get at the groundwater. And that's a big concern, I think, because, that's the short-term solution, but long-term, that's going to cause really big problems. So again, I can find the connection here to that more diversified farm that I was mentioning. Going with sustainable agricultural techniques and thinking about sustainability is so important as we head into the years ahead, where climate change is creating more and more extreme weather. So, one thing that farmers can do is really build up those soil resources. Building the soil, making a healthy soil, is a soil that can really absorb the water when it does come. And that's going to help also recharge that groundwater. So as people, basically put deeper and deeper wells in, we need to recharge that groundwater. And that, I think the most important thing farmers can do is think about building those strong, healthy soils with lots of organic matter in them.
And so is that, obviously fertilizing, other things farmers can do?
Well, it isn't so much fertilizing, it's more building the organic matter. So putting compost in, growing cover crops that keep something on the soil at all times so there's less soil erosion, and making sure that those cover crops get returned to the soil, digging them into the soil or letting them just, basically decompose. Creating a healthy soil really means building the organic matter.
What are your primary concerns regarding the future of our food system?
Well, I think that right now, with these very large farms and the high chemical use, that's very productive, but it's causing a lot of environmental issues. A lot of sort of farm effects that happen off the farm, like pollution and pesticide use. And so I think that we really need to work on the sustainability of our farm system. We need to handle this. We need to get away from what really is an unsustainable system, because it just can't persist.
I mean, it seems like that's just been the way things have gone in the past, but as you look to the future, that's not the way to make it be sustainable.
Right. I think that, we have to make a change. If we want to continue feeding people, we have to have a sustainable system. Otherwise, eventually it will just crumble.
Where do you think is the largest opportunities to reduce the environmental impact of agriculture?
Well, I think that really the kinds of things that I've been talking about, building healthy soils, making a more diverse farm system that can provide some of these benefits naturally, the pollination, the pest control, is really what we need to do to create a sustainable system.
And what do you want folks to know who are watching this at home or maybe aren't farmers? What do you think is the most important thing for them to know?
I think that what people can do individually is to think about where their food comes from and try to support the farmers that are already doing this. And there are lots of farmers that are trying really hard to create a sustainable production system. And I think, especially in Vermont, you have loads of them, which is great. It's an example for the rest of the world. So support those farmers. That's what you can do.
So food doesn't come from the grocery store.
That's right.
And there are actually a lot of farmers who will welcome folks onto the farm for different events to see what's going on, and you encourage people to do that?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so tell me, we have about a minute left. If people are interested in the work that you're doing, is there a way to find out more about that?
Absolutely. Please visit the Center for Diversified Farming System, the Berkeley Food Institute, and also my lab webpage, Kremen Lab.
And what are you working on currently?
Right now I'm actually working on a project that tries to look at the whole farm system. So we're branching out from looking at the pollinators. We're trying to understand how farm management practices, some of the practices that I mentioned, are influencing not only the pollinators but also the soil fertility, its ability to hold water, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, pest control, disease control, all those things kind of wrapped up in one. It's a challenging project.
It's very challenging. Well, Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to come see us.
Thank you for having me.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.